In the years which I spent in the companionship of Sherlock Holmes, there occurred many singular adventures which never found their way into the public records. Some were withheld at the request of influential families, others because the truth was too delicate for publication, and a few because Holmes himself deemed them unsuitable for the curious appetite of the London press. Among these hidden affairs, however, there was one which has remained more vividly in my memory than almost any other. Even now, as I write these recollections long after the events themselves, I can hear again that strange phrase spoken in a trembling voice across the breakfast table at Baker Street. "It was only a whisper, Mr. Holmes, but it changed everything." The affair became known between Holmes and myself as the Blackthorn House mystery, though the newspapers never learned enough to attach any title to it. It began during the latter part of November in the year 1893. London lay beneath one of those dense yellow fogs which seem peculiar to our city. The streets beyond our windows had vanished into a shifting wall of amber mist. Hansom cabs moved like ghostly apparitions through the gloom, while the gas lamps glowed with weak halos that scarcely penetrated the darkness. I had risen somewhat later than Holmes that morning. This was hardly unusual. My friend frequently remained awake through the night when occupied by a problem, and then astonished me by appearing at breakfast as alert and energetic as if he had enjoyed a full night's sleep. On this particular morning I found him seated beside the fire, his long fingers pressed together, his sharp grey eyes fixed upon a scrap of paper. Without looking up, he spoke. "You have visited a patient in Kensington, Watson." I confess I stopped in the act of reaching for the coffee-pot. "My dear Holmes, you saw me leave yesterday." "No." "No? I did not leave these rooms yesterday," said Holmes calmly. "Then how?" He waved a hand impatiently. "The mud upon your left boot is reddish clay mixed with gravel. There are only 3 districts within reasonable driving distance where that particular composition is commonly found. Of those 3, only Kensington possesses private residences wealthy enough to require a physician of your reputation." I laughed. "Very good. You are also paid. The folded bank-note protruding from your waistcoat pocket makes the matter obvious. Then perhaps not so excellent." Holmes smiled faintly. The distinction between observation and deduction is frequently misunderstood. He tossed the paper into the fireplace. "It is fortunate, Watson, that most criminals share that misunderstanding." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a silver tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes glanced at the clock. "At this hour?" "He insists the matter is urgent, sir." My companion rose immediately. "Then show him in." Mrs. Hudson departed. Moments later the visitor entered. At first glance he appeared to be a man of about 50 years, though anxiety had added a decade to his appearance. He was tall and well-dressed, yet his clothing seemed disordered, as if he had dressed in haste. What struck me most, however, was his expression. I had seen fear upon many faces during my medical career. This was something deeper. It was the look of a man who no longer trusted his own senses. Holmes motioned him toward a chair. "Please sit down." The newcomer lowered himself heavily. "My name is Arthur Pembroke." His voice trembled. "I was advised by Inspector Lestrade to consult you." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? Scotland Yard seeks assistance?" "The Yard believes there is no crime." "Yet you disagree." Holmes settled back. "Then begin at the beginning." For several moments Pembroke stared into the fire. When he finally spoke, his words emerged slowly. "I own a property in Surrey known as Blackthorn House." Something in his tone caused me to pay closer attention. "It has belonged to my family for nearly 70 years. "And the difficulty?" Holmes asked. Pembroke swallowed. 3 weeks ago my younger brother vanished." The room grew silent. "Vanished?" I repeated. "Completely." "Tell us the circumstances." "My brother Edward lived with me at Blackthorn House. We dined together on the evening of October 20th. He retired shortly after 10. And the next morning? He was gone." Holmes folded his hands. "His room?" "Undisturbed." "Signs of departure?" "None." "Any luggage missing?" "No." "Money?" "No." "Personal effects?" "Nothing." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "A curious disappearance. It becomes stranger." "Go on." Pembroke's fingers tightened upon the armrest. "There is a basement beneath the eastern wing." "There is a basement beneath the eastern wing." The fog pressed softly against the windows. I found myself listening with unusual attention. "The cellar has existed since the house was built. It consists of several storage rooms connected by a narrow corridor." "And?" "For years no one used it." "Why?" Pembroke hesitated. Servants disliked going there. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Disliked it? They claimed to hear sounds. What sort of sounds? A whisper. The word seemed absurd in the daylight comfort of Baker Street, yet Pembroke uttered it with such sincerity that neither Holmes nor I smiled. A whisper? Holmes repeated. Human? Apparently. Words? None that could be understood. Holmes leaned forward. When was this first reported? Many years ago. And you investigated? Repeatedly. What did you discover? Nothing. Holmes nodded. The matter would appear settled. So I believed. Pembroke looked directly at him. Until the night before Edward disappeared. For the first time Holmes displayed genuine interest. What occurred? My brother heard the whisper. The room seemed to contract around those words. He told me so at dinner. What exactly did he say? Pembroke closed his eyes briefly. He said someone was speaking beneath the house. Holmes remained motionless. Continue? I laughed at him. His voice dropped. I told him the servants had been imagining things for years. And your brother? He insisted he had heard it clearly. What words? Pembroke's face had become pale. He claimed the voice spoke his name. I felt a distinct chill. Edward? I said. And then? That night he went to investigate. You know this? He left a lantern outside the cellar door. Holmes's eyes flashed. The next morning he was gone. For several seconds Holmes said nothing. Then he asked a question so unexpected that even I stared at him. Has anyone else disappeared from Blackthorn House? Pembroke looked startled. How did you know? Holmes smiled faintly. Answer the question. Yes. My grandfather's sister. When? Nearly 40 years ago. And under unusual circumstances? Pembroke nodded slowly. She vanished without explanation. Holmes rose and crossed to the window. Outside the fog swirled against the glass. Was she ever found? No. Anyone else? Pembroke hesitated. A groundskeeper. When? 20 years ago. Also vanished? Holmes turned. His face had become unusually intent. And were there whispers before those disappearances as well? Pembroke stared. I do not know. Silence followed. I could almost hear Holmes's mind working. Finally he returned to his chair. Who currently resides at Blackthorn House? Myself, my niece Clara, 6 servants, and a caretaker. Your niece? She is 24. Your brother unmarried? Yes. Holmes nodded. Has the property been searched? By whom? The local police. And? They found nothing. Holmes glanced toward me. There was a peculiar brightness in his eyes which I had learned to recognize. A problem had seized him. I should like to visit Blackthorn House. Relief flooded Pembroke's features. You will take the case? I will examine the facts. When can you come? Holmes consulted the clock. This afternoon? Pembroke rose quickly. Thank heaven. Holmes accompanied him to the door. Before leaving, however, the man paused. There is one thing more. Holmes waited. Pembroke looked from him to me. His face had gone gray. The night Edward disappeared, I heard the whisper myself. Even Holmes seemed surprised. You heard it? Yes. What did it say? The man's answer was scarcely audible. It spoke from beneath the floor. A tremor passed through him. And it used my brother's voice. When the door closed behind our visitor, neither Holmes nor I spoke for several moments. At last I broke the silence. Surely the fellow is mistaken. Holmes lit his pipe. Perhaps. You do not sound convinced. No. What interests you? He gazed thoughtfully into the fire. The whisper interests me very little. Then what? The lantern. I frowned. The lantern? Indeed. Why? Holmes smiled. Because a man may imagine a whisper. He leaned back. But he does not imagine carrying a lantern toward it. The fog thickened beyond the windows. Somewhere in distant London a church bell sounded the hour. Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon the dancing flames. I knew that expression. The game had begun. And neither of us could have guessed that, before it ended, Blackthorn House would reveal secrets buried for half a century and that a single whisper from a forgotten basement would place us face to face with one of the most ingenious criminals Sherlock Holmes had ever encountered. It has often been remarked by those who knew Sherlock Holmes only through newspaper accounts that his investigations commenced with dramatic revelations and sensational discoveries. Such an impression could not be further from the truth. Holmes was, above all things, methodical. Where another man saw mystery, he saw data. Where another saw terror, he saw evidence. And thus it was that, on the afternoon following Arthur Pembroke's visit, we found ourselves seated in a railway carriage bound for Surrey, carrying little more than a travelling case, Holmes's violin, and a mystery that had already begun to occupy my thoughts far more than I cared to admit. The weather remained bleak. A cold drizzle swept across the countryside as our train thundered southward through fields veiled in mist. Holmes sat opposite me, long legs stretched comfortably before him, apparently absorbed in a chemical monograph. Yet I knew from experience that his mind was engaged elsewhere. Indeed, without lowering the book, he suddenly remarked, "What conclusion have you formed, Watson?" I glanced up. "About Blackthorn House? Naturally, I confess I am uncertain." I laughed. "You approve of uncertainty? I approve of intellectual honesty." He folded the book. "Most investigators begin with a theory and seek facts to support it. And you?" "I seek facts." The familiar lecture tone had entered his voice. "When sufficient facts have accumulated, the truth becomes unavoidable. You already possess a theory." "I possess several." "And the most likely?" Holmes smiled. "The least interesting." "Which is?" "A voluntary disappearance." I shook my head. "Leaving money, luggage, and possessions behind?" "Quite." "Then why consider it?" "Because every possibility must be examined." He turned toward the rain-streaked window. Although I confess the whisper complicates matters, the train rattled onward. For several minutes neither of us spoke. At length Holmes removed a folded paper from his pocket. "I made some inquiries this morning." "About the Pembrokes?" "Naturally." "And?" "The family is old, but not particularly wealthy. Yet they own a substantial estate, an estate burdened by debt. That surprised me. Significant debt. Then Edward Pembroke stood to inherit?" "Half." I sat forward. "That changes matters." "A little." "Arthur Pembroke benefits from his brother's disappearance." Holmes nodded. "He does." The thought disturbed me. Arthur Pembroke had seemed genuinely distressed, yet appearances had deceived us before. The police considered him? Briefly. And rejected him? Apparently. Why? Holmes shrugged. Perhaps because they found no evidence. The train whistle shrieked through the rain. For a time Holmes relapsed into silence. Then, unexpectedly, he changed the subject. "Observe that farmhouse." I glanced through the window. A small stone building stood alone among the fields. "What of it?" "The roof has been repaired recently." I squinted. "How can you tell at this distance?" "The coloration differs." I sighed. "You are determined to educate me." "My dear Watson, I am determined to educate the world." The corners of his mouth twitched. "Unfortunately, the world resists instruction." An hour later we arrived at the station nearest Blackthorn House. Arthur Pembroke awaited us beside a carriage. He appeared even more exhausted than before. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. "I am grateful you've come." Holmes shook his hand. "We shall soon see whether gratitude is justified." The drive to the estate occupied nearly 40 minutes. As we proceeded along winding country roads, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. Twisted trees leaned over the lanes. Dead leaves skittered across the ground. Low clouds pressed heavily upon the countryside. Even before I saw Blackthorn House, I found myself understanding why servants might invent ghost stories about it. Then the house emerged. I confess the sight impressed me. The structure stood upon a rise overlooking several acres of neglected grounds. Built of dark stone, it possessed the stern, severe appearance common to large country houses of the previous century. Numerous chimneys rose against the grey sky. Tall windows reflected the fading afternoon light. Yet despite its size there was something melancholy about the place, something isolated. As our carriage approached, Holmes observed the building without speaking. Only once did he comment. "What is?" I asked. "The eastern wing." I followed his gaze. "What about it?" "It was added later." Arthur Pembroke turned. "You are correct." Holmes merely nodded. No explanation followed. The carriage halted before the entrance. Butler admitted us. Within, the atmosphere proved warmer than the exterior suggested. A fire crackled in the main hall. Oil portraits lined the walls. Ancestors stared sternly from gilded frames. Arthur Pembroke removed his gloves. "My niece is here." A young woman descended the staircase as he spoke. I immediately understood why Holmes's attention sharpened. Miss Clara Pembroke possessed remarkable composure. Though plainly worried, she retained a calm dignity that impressed me. She greeted us warmly. "My uncle speaks very highly of you, Mr. Holmes. He is generous." Her eyes flickered toward Holmes. "No." The answer came quickly. "He believes you are our only hope." Holmes studied her. I recognized the look. He was assessing not her appearance, but her character. Few people realized how carefully Holmes observed emotional details. A man's handwriting, a woman's hesitation, a fleeting glance, nothing escaped him. "Your uncle informs me that you were present before your brother's disappearance." "My uncle's brother?" "Quite?" She nodded. "Did you hear the whisper?" A shadow crossed her face. "No." "Did Edward mention it?" "He did." She hesitated. "He seemed frightened." "Not excited?" "No." "Certain?" "Quite certain." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Fear interested him. A frightened man behaves differently from a curious one. A frightened man expects danger. The distinction was important. "May we see the cellar?" Arthur Pembroke exchanged a glance with his niece. "Immediately, if possible?" The older man hesitated. "I should prefer daylight." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we shall not delay." 10 minutes later we found ourselves crossing the eastern wing. The atmosphere changed noticeably. The hallways narrowed. The furnishings became sparse, dust-coated unused surfaces. At the end of a passage stood a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. Arthur Pembroke stopped. "The cellar." Holmes examined the door. "Locked?" "Always." "Who possesses keys?" "Myself and the caretaker." The door opened with a groan. A stairway descended into darkness. Arthur lit a lantern. I confess that a peculiar sensation passed through me as we began our descent. The air below felt colder, older. Stone walls enclosed a narrow staircase. Moisture glistened upon the surfaces. Our footsteps echoed softly. At the bottom lay a corridor stretching into darkness. Several rooms opened from either side. Storage chambers, wine vaults, and forgotten utility spaces. Nothing unusual, at least at first glance. Holmes proceeded slowly. Every few feet he stopped, examined, measured, observed. I had seen him inspect murder scenes with less care. Finally he paused. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed downward. Marks upon the floor, almost invisible. I knelt beside them. "What do you make of those?" "A wheel." "A wheel?" "Small." I looked closer. He was right. A narrow groove crossed the dusty stone. It disappeared toward the darkness. Arthur Pembroke frowned. "I've never noticed that." "No." Holmes continued onward. The corridor terminated at a blank stone wall. Nothing more. No secret passage, no hidden chamber, merely stone. Yet Holmes examined it for nearly 5 minutes. He tapped various sections, measured distances, inspected mortar. At last he stepped back. "Curios." "What is curious?" I asked. "The wall. It seems ordinary enough." "Precisely." I blinked. Holmes smiled. "When something appears perfectly ordinary, Watson, one should immediately become suspicious." Before I could request clarification, a sudden sound interrupted us. A faint noise, so faint that I almost missed it. It seemed to drift through the darkness. A whisper. I froze. Arthur Pembroke's lantern trembled violently. Miss Pembroke drew a sharp breath. The sound came again. Miss Pembroke drew a sharp breath. The sound came again. Indistinct, almost impossible to understand, yet unmistakably human. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Holmes strode directly toward the wall. The whisper ceased. Silence returned. Complete silence. The effect was strangely unsettling. Arthur Pembroke had gone pale. "You heard it?" Holmes pressed his ear against the stone. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Nothing whatsoever. I felt a growing uneasiness. For the first time since taking the case, I began to wonder whether some genuinely inexplicable element existed beneath Blackthorn House. Holmes stepped away. His expression remained unreadable. "Most interesting." Arthur stared at him. "You know what it is?" "No." "But you have an idea." Holmes turned toward the staircase. "Several." His voice sounded thoughtful. "Far too many." We returned upstairs shortly afterward. As we entered the hall, Holmes suddenly stopped before one of the portraits. It depicted a severe-looking gentleman in military attire. "Who is this?" Arthur glanced at the painting. "My grandfather." "The one whose sister vanished?" Holmes studied the portrait, then another, and another. At last his eyes settled upon a painting hanging near the staircase. A young woman, beautiful, dark-haired, elegant. The canvas appeared very old. "Who is she?" Arthur's face tightened. "My great-aunt Eleanor. The woman who disappeared 40 years ago?" Holmes gazed at the portrait for an unusually long time. Then he smiled, a very small smile, one I had learned to distrust. Whenever Holmes smiled in that manner, it meant he had noticed something important, something he had no intention of explaining. Not yet. That evening, as we retired to our rooms, I found my curiosity nearly unbearable. For the first time in the case, Holmes appeared genuinely excited. He sat beside the fire, smoking silently. Finally I spoke. "You have discovered something, perhaps, about the whisper?" "No." "The disappearances?" "Indirectly." "What then?" Holmes stared into the flames. "The portrait?" I groaned. "The portrait tells you something?" "It tells me many things, and you intend to share none of them." "Precisely." He smiled. Then his face grew serious. "Lock your door tonight, Watson." I sat upright. "Why?" "Because if my suspicions are correct—" He paused. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees surrounding Blackthorn House. "Then someone in this house is becoming extremely nervous." And with those alarming words, Holmes extinguished his pipe and returned to his thoughts, while I lay awake long into the night wondering whether the true danger beneath Blackthorn House came not from a whisper in the cellar, but from someone walking freely above it. That night at Blackthorn House remains among the most unsettling I have ever spent in the company of Sherlock Holmes. The wind had strengthened after sunset, sweeping across the Surrey countryside with a mournful cry that seemed to circle endlessly around the old mansion. Branches scraped against the windows. Loose shutters rattled intermittently. More than once I found myself glancing toward the door, recalling Holmes's peculiar warning. "Lock your door tonight, Watson." It was not the sort of advice he offered lightly. My room occupied a corner of the western wing and overlooked the neglected gardens. Before retiring, I carefully examined the lock, drew the curtains, and placed my revolver upon the bedside table, a habit acquired during many years of association with Holmes. Yet sleep did not come easily. My thoughts returned again and again to the strange whisper in the cellar. I had heard it myself. There could be no doubt of that. The sound had been faint, certainly, but unmistakably human. What troubled me most was Holmes's reaction. He had not seemed surprised by the phenomenon itself. Instead, he appeared fascinated by something connected to it, something invisible to everyone else. Near midnight, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. How long I remained asleep I cannot say. I awoke suddenly. A sound had disturbed me. At first I thought it was the wind. Then I heard it again, a footstep, deliberate, outside my room. Instantly alert, I sat upright. Another step followed, then silence. The corridor beyond my door lay utterly still. I reached for the revolver. The house seemed to be holding its breath. A minute passed, then two. Just as I began convincing myself that I had imagined the noise, a sharp knock sounded against the door. 3 taps. Quiet. Measured. I rose at once. "Who is it?" No answer. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I crossed the room cautiously and opened the door. The corridor was empty. No servant, no guest, no intruder. Only darkness stretching away beneath the dim glow of distant lamps. I stepped outside. Nothing. Then I noticed something lying upon the carpet, a folded piece of paper. I picked it up. The note contained only 4 words. "Leave before morning comes." A chill passed through me. The handwriting appeared hurried and uneven. Who had written it? And why? I immediately crossed the corridor and knocked upon Holmes's door. His voice answered instantly. "Come in, Watson." The response surprised me. He sounded fully awake. Holmes sat in a chair beside the window, dressed and alert. A lantern burned upon the table. "My dear Holmes," I exclaimed, "you haven't gone to bed?" "No." His eyes moved toward the paper in my hand. "I see our nervous friend has visited you as well." "As well?" Without a word, Holmes handed me a second note. The message read, "Stop investigating Blackthorn House." I looked up. "When did this arrive?" "Approximately 20 minutes ago." "And you did not tell me?" "You were asleep." I examined the handwriting. It matched mine exactly. The same person, undoubtedly. "Did you see anyone?" "No." Holmes appeared amused. "I confess I find the gesture encouraging." "Encouraging?" "Certainly." He leaned back. A criminal who feels compelled to issue warnings is usually a criminal who fears discovery. That was classic Holmes. Where another man saw danger, he saw confirmation. "Then you know who sent it?" "No." "Have you formed a theory?" "Several." He glanced toward the window. "The more interesting question concerns timing." "Timing?" "Indeed." "Why?" "Because whoever delivered the notes knew we were awake. I considered this. The implication was disturbing. Someone is watching us." "Precisely." Before I could respond, a distant sound drifted through the house. A cry, but unmistakable. A woman's voice. Holmes was on his feet instantly. We rushed into the corridor. Doors opened throughout the house. Servants emerged carrying candles. Arthur Pembroke appeared in a dressing gown. "What happened?" The cry came again, this time from downstairs. We hurried toward the main hall. There we found Clara Pembroke standing near the staircase. Her face was white. She pointed toward the eastern wing. "It came from there." "Who cried out?" asked Holmes. "I don't know." A servant stepped forward nervously. "I heard it too, sir." Another nodded. "So did I." The entire household appeared shaken. Holmes moved quickly. "Has anyone checked the eastern wing?" "No." "Then we shall do so immediately." Lanterns were gathered. Within moments, a small group proceeded down the corridor leading toward the cellar entrance. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had been merely mysterious now felt threatening. Even the servants seemed reluctant to advance. At last we reached the heavy cellar door. It stood open. Arthur Pembroke stopped abruptly. "I locked that." Holmes knelt. His lantern illuminated the lock. No sign of force. "Impossible." "Not impossible." Holmes entered first. The remainder of us followed. The cellar corridor stretched before us. Yet after only a few yards Holmes suddenly halted. Something lay upon the floor. A lantern. Arthur Pembroke stared. "My God! Do you recognize it?" asked Holmes. His voice had become little more than a whisper. It belonged to Edward. A murmur passed through the group. The missing man's lantern, after 3 weeks, found in the very place where he had vanished. Holmes examined it carefully. Then he stood. I was beginning to dislike that word. "What have you found?" Instead of answering, Holmes pointed toward the dust. Fresh footprints. Someone had been here recently, very recently. The tracks moved down the corridor toward the blank stone wall we had examined earlier. There they ended, simply ended. No return prints, no sign of departure. Nothing. It was as though the individual had vanished into solid stone. Several servants crossed themselves. Arthur Pembroke looked visibly shaken. Even I found the sight difficult to explain. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated. His eyes shone with excitement. "Excellent," I repeated. "Quite." "Holmes, a man disappears, mysterious footprints end at a wall, and you call it excellent?" "Naturally." He tapped the stone surface. "Because walls, unlike ghosts, can be investigated." For nearly 10 minutes he examined every inch of masonry. At length he straightened. "Not tonight." Arthur stared. "Not tonight?" "No." "Why not?" "Because someone expects us to search." The answer made little sense. Holmes turned toward the staircase. "Let us return upstairs." Nobody argued. The atmosphere in the cellar had become oppressive. As we climbed back into the house, I noticed Clara Pembroke studying Holmes intently. She waited until the others moved ahead. Then she approached him quietly. "Miss Holmes, Miss Pembroke, there is something I haven't told you." Holmes stopped. "What is it?" She glanced around nervously. "My uncle mustn't hear." "Very well." The young woman hesitated. Then she spoke words that instantly captured Holmes's attention. "3 nights before Edward disappeared, he showed me something." "What?" "A piece of paper." "What sort of paper?" "I don't know." "Describe it." "It looked old." Holmes nodded. "Go on." "He found it hidden inside a book." "What was written on it?" "I couldn't read it clearly." "Why not?" "Because Edward put it away the moment he saw me." "Did he say anything?" "Only 1 sentence." "What sentence?" Miss Pembroke swallowed. "He said that if the paper was genuine, everything our family believed about Blackthorn House was a lie." For perhaps the first time since arriving, Holmes looked genuinely startled. "Allier, what happened to the paper?" "I don't know." "Did anyone else see it?" "Not that I'm aware of." Holmes was silent for several moments. Then he bowed slightly. "Thank you, Miss Pembroke." After she departed, I turned immediately toward him. "Well?" His expression had become intensely thoughtful. "Watson." "Yes?" "The case has just become considerably more interesting." "Because of the paper?" "Because of what the paper implies." "And what does it imply?" Holmes glanced toward the dark corridor leading back to the cellar. "It suggests that Edward Pembroke discovered a secret." "What secret?" A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. "The very question I intend to answer." Outside, the wind continued its lonely cry across the grounds of Blackthorn House. Somewhere beneath us, hidden within stone and darkness, lay the truth behind the whisper. And for the first time I sensed that we were moving closer to it. Unfortunately, so was the person determined to keep it buried. The events of that strange night left the household of Blackthorn House in a state of visible agitation. Servants whispered in corners. Doors were locked more carefully. Even Arthur Pembroke, who had spent weeks attempting to preserve a calm exterior, appeared shaken by the discovery of his brother's lantern in the cellar. Yet if the household was disturbed, Sherlock Holmes seemed invigorated. I found him the following morning standing at an upper window overlooking the grounds, his hands clasped behind his back. The sky had cleared during the night. Cold sunlight spread across the estate. The neglected garden stretched away beneath a thin layer of frost. Holmes did not turn as I entered. "Observe the gardener." I joined him. A man was crossing the far side of the grounds carrying a wheelbarrow. What about him? He is left-handed. At this distance? The wheelbarrow favors the right side. I sighed. One day I shall cease asking. An admirable go. He finally turned. You slept poorly. I wonder why. The footsteps, the warning note, the whisper, the disappearing footprints. Holmes smiled faintly. A reasonable collection of concerns. Before I could reply, there came a knock at the door. Arthur Pembroke entered. His expression suggested that he had received troubling news. Miss Holmes, good morning. I have just spoken with the caretaker. Indeed? He remembered something. Holmes gestured toward a chair. Arthur sat. The night Edward vanished, another man was seen near the cellar. For the first time that morning Holmes appeared genuinely interested. The caretaker believes it was James Holloway. Holloway? My brother's former business associate. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. A business associate? What sort of business? Arthur hesitated. Mining investments. Holmes nodded. Successful? No. Unsuccessful? Disastrously so. The answer seemed significant. Tell me about Mr. Holloway. Arthur leaned forward. The man lost a considerable sum of money. How considerable? Nearly £10,000. I whistled softly. Even Holmes raised an eyebrow. In Edward's ventures? And blamed your brother? Entirely. Did they quarrel? Repeatedly? Publicly? Holmes folded his hands. Arthur nodded eagerly. That's what I thought. I could almost see his reasoning. A man ruined financially. A history of disputes. A mysterious disappearance. The conclusion seemed obvious. Perhaps too obvious. Holmes appeared to share the thought. Has Holloway been questioned? By the police. And? They found nothing. Where was he on the night Edward vanished? At home. Verified? Apparently. Holmes rose. I should like to meet him. Arthur blinked. Today? If possible? The older man nodded. I can arrange it. As soon as he departed, I turned toward Holmes. You don't believe it. Believe what? That Holloway is responsible. No. The answer came instantly. Why not? Because Arthur Pembroke wishes him to be responsible. I frowned. Surely that's natural. Quite natural. Holmes moved toward the fireplace. Yet one must always be cautious when evidence arrives conveniently. I considered this. Then you think the caretaker's memory may have improved suspiciously? Holmes smiled. Very good, Watson. Before I could enjoy the compliment, Clara Pembroke appeared in the doorway. She looked troubled. Mr. Holmes? Miss Pembroke? There is someone here. Indeed? Apology, Inspector. Holmes sighed. Then Scotland Yard has finally arrived. The visitor proved to be Inspector Gregory of the Yard. I had encountered him once before and found him considerably more capable than many of his colleagues. He greeted Holmes politely. Miss Holmes. Inspector, I understand you've taken an interest in our Surrey mystery. I have. Gregory nodded. Then perhaps you can explain something. Holmes smiled. I rarely explain things before breakfast. The inspector ignored the remark. We arrested James Holloway this morning. Arthur Pembroke, who had re-entered moments earlier, nearly jumped from his chair. You arrested him? Yes. Holmes's expression remained unchanged. On what grounds? Gregory removed a notebook. A witness saw him near the estate on the night of the disappearance. Holmes said nothing. A second witness confirms long-standing hostility between Holloway and Edward Pembroke. Still Holmes remained silent. Gregory continued. And this morning we discovered correspondence containing threats. Arthur looked relieved. There. Holmes merely nodded. The inspector frowned. Only interesting? What would you prefer? Agreement. Holmes lit his pipe. I seldom provide agreement before examining evidence. Gregory folded his notebook. You believe we've arrested the wrong man. I believe nothing. The inspector snorted. That usually means you disagree. Holmes smiled. A useful observation. After Gregory departed, Arthur seemed almost offended by Holmes's lack of enthusiasm. Surely the evidence is strong. Perhaps you don't sound convinced. No. Why? Holmes leaned back. Because threats are common? Common? Extraordinarily common. He pointed toward the fire. Every prison in England contains men who threaten someone before committing no crime whatsoever. Arthur appeared unconvinced. The witnesses may be correct. The motive may exist. The opportunity may have existed. Holmes blew a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. Yet something troubles me. Why? The lantern. Once again he returned to that object. I was beginning to suspect it occupied a central position in his reasoning. What about it? I asked. Holmes turned. Suppose Holloway murdered Edward. Very well. Why leave the lantern in the cellar 3 weeks later? I opened my mouth, then closed it. The point was obvious. A guilty man attempting to conceal a crime would hardly return to deposit evidence. Arthur frowned. Perhaps he dropped it. Holmes smiled. 3 weeks after the disappearance? No answer came. The silence lingered. Finally Holmes stood. I should like to inspect Edward Pembroke's room. Arthur nodded. Of course. The missing man's bedroom occupied the second floor. It had been left almost exactly as it was on the night he vanished. Books lined the shelves. Clothing remained neatly arranged. A watch rested upon a bedside table. Nothing appeared disturbed. Holmes entered slowly. He spent several minutes examining the room without speaking. Then his attention settled upon a bookcase. Did your brother read extensively? Arthur looked surprised. Very much so. Holmes nodded. I thought so. He began inspecting the shelves, volume after volume. Travel. Poetry. Then suddenly he stopped. A narrow gap existed between two books, a missing volume. Holmes touched the empty space. What book stood here? Arthur frowned. I don't know. Can you find out? Perhaps. Holmes stepped back. The missing book appeared to interest him greatly. Why is that important? I asked. Because Miss Pembroke mentioned a paper. The hidden paper. Precisely. He glanced toward the gap. If Edward discovered a secret document, it was likely concealed within a book. Arthur stared. You think the missing volume contained it? I consider the possibility. The older man looked alarmed. Then someone removed it. Possibly. After Edward vanished. Possibly. Holmes smiled faintly. A great many possibilities. The search continued for another hour. Drawers were examined. Letters reviewed. Documents inspected. Yet nothing of significance emerged. At least nothing obvious. Then, as we prepared to leave, Holmes suddenly crouched beside the fireplace. His fingers moved across the hearth. A moment later he lifted something from the ashes, a fragment of burned paper, blackened, almost destroyed, yet not entirely. Holmes carried it toward the window. I watched his eyes narrow. What is it? He handed it to me. Only a few words remained legible. The rightful heir. Below that, hidden beneath, the rest had been consumed by fire. Arthur's face drained of color. My God! Holmes folded the fragment carefully and placed it in his pocket. The atmosphere within the room had changed. For the first time we possessed evidence that Edward had indeed discovered something. Something important enough for someone to destroy. What does it mean? Arthur whispered. Holmes gazed thoughtfully around the room. I am not yet certain, but it concerns inheritance. Perhaps the rightful heir. Arthur swallowed. You think it relates to my family? Holmes looked directly at him. I think, Mr. Pembroke, that your family has been keeping secrets for a very long time. No one spoke. The words seemed to linger in the room. Then Holmes moved toward the door. As we reached the hallway, a servant came hurrying toward us. He looked frightened. Mr. Pembroke? What is it? The caretaker, sir. What about him? The servant hesitated, then spoke the words that caused every face present to change. We can't find him. A cold silence followed. The caretaker is missing. And suddenly the mystery of Blackthorn House had claimed a second disappearance. The announcement of the caretaker's disappearance produced immediate confusion throughout Blackthorn House. Servants hurried through corridors. Doors were opened and searched. Outbuildings, stables, and storage sheds were examined. Yet as the hours passed, one fact became increasingly clear. The caretaker had vanished as completely as Edward Pembroke. No farewell. No luggage, no explanation. It was as though the man had stepped into the air itself and dissolved. Naturally, comparisons with the earlier disappearance spread rapidly through the household. By afternoon, several servants appeared genuinely terrified. Even Arthur Pembroke struggled to maintain his composure. Only Sherlock Holmes seemed unaffected. If anything, the new development appeared to confirm some private line of reasoning. Indeed, as we crossed the grounds after lunch, I observed a faint spark of satisfaction in his eyes. "You expected this?" Holmes glanced at me. "Expected what?" "The caretaker's disappearance. I considered it possible." "Why?" "Because he remembered too much." The answer puzzled me. "He merely identified Holloway." "Precisely." Holmes walked slowly along a gravel path bordered by dead rose bushes. "The information arrived at a most convenient moment." "You think he lied?" "I think he repeated what someone wished him to repeat. Then why disappear?" Holmes smiled faintly. "An excellent question." The winter sun hung low behind drifting clouds. For a time we walked in silence. Then Holmes abruptly changed direction. "Where?" The dead often proved surprisingly helpful. I had heard many peculiar statements from Holmes. This ranked among the more unusual. The village church stood less than half a mile from the estate. An ancient structure of grey stone surrounded by weathered graves. Its vicar, a kindly gentleman named Reverend Morton, greeted us warmly. Holmes wasted little time. "I understand the Pembroke family has worshipped here for generations." "Indeed. Then perhaps you maintain family records." The vicar nodded. "Quite extensive records." Holmes smiled. Within minutes we found ourselves seated in a small study surrounded by dusty ledgers. The vicar produced volumes dating back decades. Marriages, baptisms, a complete history of the district. Holmes examined them with astonishing speed. Pages flickered beneath his fingers. Names appeared and vanished. Dates were noted. Relationships traced. I attempted to follow his progress, but soon lost the thread entirely. Then suddenly he stopped. A name had captured his attention. He read the entry twice, then a third time. I leaned forward. "What is it?" Instead of answering, Holmes turned several pages backward, then forward again. His eyes narrowed. A minute later he closed the book. The expression upon his face was unmistakable. He had found something important. "Interesting," he murmured. The vicar smiled. "Useful?" "Extremely." I waited until we had departed the church before questioning him. "Well?" Holmes adjusted his coat against the cold wind. "Our family history grows more complicated." "Meaning?" "Meaning that Arthur Pembroke's account was incomplete." "In what way?" Holmes looked amused. "I shall tell you later." I groaned. He ignored me. "Tell me, Watson." "Yeah." "What do you know about inheritance law?" "Very little." "An advantage in this case." "How can ignorance be advantageous?" "Because it prevents premature conclusions." With that infuriating remark he lapsed into silence. Upon returning to Blackthorn House we learned that Inspector Gregory had arrived once more. The inspector appeared considerably less confident than during his previous visit. Still no sign of the caretaker. "No?" said Holmes. "No." "And Holloway?" Gregory frowned. "We released him." Arthur Pembroke looked astonished. "Released?" "The witnesses withdrew their statements." Holmes nodded slowly. "As I expected." The inspector shot him an irritated look. "You expected everything." "No." "Then what did you expect?" "That the obvious solution would collapse." Gregory folded his arms. "You have another suspect." "Several." The inspector sighed. "I was afraid you might say that." Holmes smiled pleasantly. "You should consider it a sign of progress." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Yet before leaving, Gregory pulled me aside. "Does he know something?" "Holmes?" I considered the question. "Almost certainly." "And he won't tell anyone?" "Almost certainly." The inspector shook his head. "Remarkable man. Infuriating man." "That too." That evening Holmes requested access to every room in the eastern wing. Arthur Pembroke readily agreed. Thus began one of the strangest searches I have ever witnessed. Most investigators search for objects. Holmes searched for absences. He measured wall thicknesses, counted windows, compared external dimensions with interior spaces, examined ceilings, inspected floorboards. At one point he spent 15 minutes studying a broom closet. I confess my patience began to wear thin. "What exactly are we looking for?" Holmes tapped a wall thoughtfully. "A contradiction." "A contradiction?" "Architecture rarely lies." I sighed. "Unlike people." "Precisely." The search continued until darkness fell. Then, at last, Holmes paused in a narrow corridor adjacent to the cellar staircase. His eyes moved from one wall to another, then upward, then downward. A curious expression crossed his face. "There you are." I looked around. "Where?" He ignored me. Instead, he removed a tape measure from his pocket. Several calculations followed, then another. Finally he stepped back. A smile appeared, not his usual smile. This one contained genuine satisfaction. "You've found something." "What?" Holmes lowered his voice. "A room?" I blinked. "A room? A hidden room." For a moment I thought he was joking. Then I realized he was perfectly serious. "A hidden room inside the house?" "Undoubtedly." "Where?" He tapped the wall beside him. "Beyond this section." The wall appeared entirely ordinary. Solid stone. Nothing more. "How can you be certain?" "The exterior dimensions exceed the interior measurements by nearly 12 feet. I looked again. Suddenly the corridor seemed different, not smaller. Incomplete. "Good heavens!" "Quite." "Then the missing space." "Why hasn't anyone found it?" Holmes smiled. "Because nobody thought to measure." For several moments neither of us spoke. The discovery felt enormously significant. A hidden room. Inside a house already haunted by disappearances and whispers. The possibilities were endless. "When do we open it?" Holmes's smile vanished. We don't." "Not yet." "Why?" "Because someone is watching." The answer came so quietly that I almost missed it. My eyes widened. "You know that?" "I suspect it." I don't know." He glanced toward the shadows at the end of the corridor. Then he lowered his voice even further. "Which is precisely why we shall tell no one." Later that night after dinner the household gathered in uneasy silence. The atmosphere had grown strained. Every conversation seemed forced. Every glance carried suspicion. Arthur Pembroke appeared exhausted. Clara looked increasingly worried. The servants moved nervously through their duties, and all the while Holmes observed, watching, listening. At one point he leaned toward me. "Notice Miss Pembroke." I followed his gaze. "What about her?" "She is frightened." "Naturally." "No." His eyes remained fixed upon her. "This is different." "Different how?" "She fears a person." I studied her more carefully. Now that Holmes had pointed it out, I saw it. Whenever certain members of the household approached, she became tense, watchful, guarded. The realization disturbed me. "Who is she afraid of?" Holmes smiled. Realization disturbed me. "Who is she afraid of?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The answer to that question may solve our case." Near midnight I retired to my room. This time sleep came more easily. The day's events had exhausted me. I do not know how long I slept. Perhaps an hour. Perhaps 2. Then I awoke. A sound had disturbed me. A whisper. For several seconds I remained motionless. The room lay dark around me. The sound came again. Barely audible, yet unmistakable. A whisper. My pulse quickened. I rose quietly and approached the door. The sound seemed to come from below, from somewhere beneath the house, the cellar. For a moment I considered waking Holmes. Then another thought occurred to me. What if Holmes already knew? Carefully I opened my door. The corridor beyond stood empty. Moonlight spilled through distant windows. The whisper came again, almost mournful. I followed it, down the staircase, past silent hallways, toward the eastern wing. Every instinct warned me to stop. Yet curiosity drove me onward. At last I reached the cellar door. It stood slightly open, a narrow line of darkness beyond. The whisper seemed louder now, still indistinct, still impossible to understand, but undeniably present. My hand closed around the lantern hanging nearby. I lifted it, then froze. Something lay on the floor directly before the cellar entrance, a sheet of paper. Waiting, I picked it up, opened it, and felt my blood run cold. For written across the page in hurried ink were 5 words. "The air is still alive." The lantern trembled in my hand. Somewhere beneath Blackthorn House the whisper continued, and for the first time I began to suspect that the mystery was not merely about a disappearance. It was about a secret that someone had been willing to protect for nearly half a century. I remained motionless for several seconds, staring at the words upon the paper. "The air is still alive." The sentence appeared simple enough, yet in the context of Blackthorn House it possessed a disturbing significance. The burned fragment Holmes had discovered in Edward Pembroke's room had contained similar language, the rightful heir. And now this anonymous message spoke once more of an heir, not an inheritance, not an estate, a person, a living person. I folded the note carefully and hurried back toward Holmes's room. To my surprise I found the door already open. A lamp burned within. Holmes sat at a table surrounded by papers. He looked up as I entered. I was wondering how long it would take. "You expected me?" "Naturally." I handed him the note. He read it. His expression did not change. "You say that far too often." "I say it only when appropriate." I pointed toward the paper. "Someone left this beside the cellar." You knew? I suspected. I sank into a chair. Holmes, are you ever surprised? Occasionally. When? When people behave rationally. Despite the tension of the moment, I laughed. He folded the paper and placed it beside several other documents. Only then did I notice something unusual. Where did those come from? The library. You've been searching all night? I've been reading. Reading what? Family records. That immediately captured my attention. The Pembroke family? Precisely. Holmes tapped one of the documents. Tell me, Watson, what happens when history is rewritten? I frowned. Rewritten? Suppose a family wishes to conceal an embarrassing truth. They alter records. Exactly. He leaned back. And what if they alter them well? The lie becomes accepted, even by later generations. A chill passed through me. You believe that has happened here? I know it has. I sat upright. Then you've solved it. Holmes smiled. No. Not even close. The answer surprised me. If you know the secret. I know part of the secret. He glanced toward the window. The dangerous part remains hidden. The following morning brought fresh chaos. A maid burst into the breakfast room before anyone had finished eating. Her face was white. Her hands trembled visibly. Miss Pembroke. Clara immediately rose. What is it? The maid struggled to speak. Mr. Pembroke. Arthur looked up. Yes? The cellar door is open again. A silence fell over the room. Arthur slowly set down his teacup. I locked it. The maid nodded frantically. It's open now, sir. Holmes rose at once. Call me, Watson. Within minutes we were descending the familiar stone staircase. The atmosphere felt even colder than before. The lantern light danced upon damp walls. At the bottom of the stairs we found something unexpected. A trail. Fresh footprints, clearly visible in the dust. Arthur gasped. They weren't here yesterday. No, said Holmes. They were not. The tracks moved along the corridor toward the blank stone wall. The same wall. The same impossible destination. This time, however, there was a difference. The footprints were accompanied by another set. Smaller. Lighter. A second individual. The two trails ended together at the wall. Once again there was no return. No indication of departure. Nothing. Inspector Gregory, who had arrived only minutes earlier, stared in disbelief. This is absurd. Holmes crouched beside the prince. Not at all. You mean to say two people walked into solid stone? No. Then explain it. Holmes smiled faintly. When I can prove it. The inspector groaned. I confess I shared his frustration. The morning passed in renewed searching. Every inch of the cellar received examination. All at once they seemed connected. Yet before anyone could respond, a sound echoed through the cellar. A door slammed. Somewhere beyond the hidden chamber. Holmes spun instantly. His eyes flashed. There! For the first time since the case began, I saw genuine urgency in him. Someone had been listening. And now that person was running. The hunt had begun. The sound of the slamming door had scarcely faded when Holmes sprang forward. Quickly! Without waiting for an answer, he darted across the hidden chamber. I followed at once. Gregory came behind us. Arthur and Clara remained where they stood, too stunned by the revelations to react immediately. The hidden room appeared to possess no second exit. Yet Holmes had clearly heard something. A faint scrape echoed from behind one of the bookcases. Here, he cried. The great shelf had shifted slightly. Not enough for a casual observer to notice. Enough for Holmes. He seized the edge and pulled. The structure swung outward. A concealed passage lay beyond. Cold air rushed from the darkness. Gregory swore softly. A second tunnel. Exactly. Holmes raised his lantern. The narrow passage descended sharply into the earth. Stone walls pressed close on either side. Dust covered the floor. And there... Someone had passed through only moments earlier. We hurried forward. The tunnel twisted beneath the estate. At times it became so narrow that we were forced to proceed single file. The air smelled of damp earth and age. Several times I nearly lost my footing upon the uneven floor. Ahead of us came the faint sound of movement, a footstep, then another. We were gaining. Suddenly the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The lantern illuminated old crates, broken furniture, and piles of discarded household items. A storage vault forgotten by time. But it was empty. Our quarry had moved on. Holmes's eyes swept the room. Then he pointed. A second doorway, still swinging. Whoever had passed through it had done so only seconds before. The pursuit continued. We emerged into another corridor, then another. The hidden network beneath Blackthorn House proved astonishingly extensive. Clearly it had been constructed deliberately. not for convenience, for secrecy. At last the passage began rising. A staircase appeared. We climbed rapidly. The sound of running feet echoed somewhere ahead. Then a door burst open. Daylight flooded the tunnel. "After him!" shouted Gregory. We emerged into the open air. The tunnel exited among a cluster of abandoned outbuildings at the edge of the estate. A figure was running across the frosted field. For a brief moment I saw only a dark silhouette. Then the individual turned, and I recognized him. Arthur Pembroke gasped behind me. "No." The words escaped him like a prayer. The fleeing figure was not a servant, not a stranger, not an intruder. It was Edwin Mercer, the family solicitor. For several seconds none of us moved. The revelation was so unexpected that it stunned everyone. Mercer had visited Blackthorn House repeatedly during our investigation. A quiet, respectable man in his late 50s. Entirely unremarkable. The last person anyone would suspect, except apparently Sherlock Holmes. Gregory recovered first. "Stop!" Mercer ignored him. The solicitor continued running. Holmes remained surprisingly calm. He did not pursue. Instead, he turned toward Gregory. "The bridge." The inspector blinked. "What?" "The old bridge near the northern road." Gregory stared. Then understanding dawned. Without another word he raced toward the waiting constables stationed nearby. Holmes watched him go. I looked from Mercer to Holmes. "You knew!" "I suspected." The answer no longer surprised me. "Why not chase him?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because Mr. Mercer is running exactly where I expected." Sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, distant shouts echoed across the fields. Then silence. Gregory returned shortly afterward, accompanied by 2 constables. Between them walked Mercer. His shoulders sagged. His face had become gray. The struggle was over. Back inside Blackthorn House, the household assembled in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was electric. Confusion. Anticipation. Every emotion seemed present. Mercer sat beneath the watchful eyes of Gregory's officers. He no longer attempted denial, yet he remained silent. Holmes stood beside the fireplace. For several moments he said nothing. Then he addressed Arthur Pembroke. "Mr. Pembroke." Arthur looked exhausted. "You deserve an explanation." "Indeed I do." Holmes nodded. "The mystery began long before Edward Pembroke vanished." The room fell silent. "More than 40 years ago." His eyes moved toward the portrait of Eleanor hanging above the mantel. "The entire case centers upon one person." "Eleanor?" asked Clara. Holmes folded his hands. "Because Eleanor Pembroke never disappeared." The statement sent a murmur through the room. Arthur shook his head. "But the records were altered. The witnesses were misled. The family history was rewritten." Holmes glanced toward Mercer. "And Mr. Mercer spent many years ensuring that it remained rewritten." The solicitor lowered his eyes. Holmes continued. 40 years ago Eleanor Pembroke fell in love." Arthur frowned. "There is nothing unusual in that, except for the man she loved." Holmes's voice remained calm. "He worked on the estate." A silence followed. "The family considered him socially unacceptable." Clara nodded slowly. "My mother told me part of this." Holmes inclined his head. "They married secretly." Arthur stared. "Married? The family never knew?" "They discovered the truth eventually." Holmes looked toward the portrait, and reacted badly. I felt the room tightening around us. The story was finally emerging. Eleanor became pregnant. Arthur closed his eyes. "My God!" The scandal threatened the family's reputation. Holmes continued relentlessly. "So a solution was devised." "What solution?" whispered Clara. "They announced Eleanor's disappearance." The silence became profound. She did not vanish. Holmes gestured toward the hidden chamber beneath the house. She was hidden. No one spoke. The implications were horrifying. "Hidden?" Arthur whispered. "For years." The older man sank into a chair. His face had become pale. "That's impossible." "No." Holmes's voice softened slightly. "It is merely cruel." Mercer finally spoke. His voice sounded old. Very old. "You know everything." Holmes looked at him. "Almost." The solicitor laughed bitterly. "Then finish it." Holmes nodded. "Eleanor gave birth to a daughter." Clara closed her eyes. "My grandmother." "Precisely." The hidden heir. The missing branch of the family. The secret preserved for decades. Everything suddenly aligned. The burned fragment. The anonymous notes. The altered records. The whispers. All of it. Arthur stared at Clara. "Yes," said Holmes quietly. "Your niece belongs to the rightful line." The room exploded into confusion. Arthur looked utterly stunned. Mercer merely stared at the floor. Holmes raised a hand. "There is more." Immediately the room fell silent again. Eleanor eventually died. Clara wiped away tears. And her daughter? Remained hidden. Arthur looked horrified. For how long? Most of her life? No one could speak. The cruelty of it seemed almost unimaginable. Holmes turned toward Mercer. "You inherited responsibility for the secret." The solicitor nodded slowly. "My father before me. A family obligation. One you considered necessary." Mercer's voice hardened. "You don't understand. Then explain." The solicitor looked around the room. "The estate would have been lost." Holmes's expression did not change. "So you stole a woman's life." Mercer had no answer. At last Arthur found his voice. "And Edward?" The question silenced everyone. Holmes nodded. "The most important question." Every eye remained fixed upon him. "What happened to Edward?" For the first time Mercer appeared genuinely uneasy. His hands tightened. His composure faltered. Holmes noticed immediately. The detective's voice became very quiet. "Now we arrive at the crime." A chill passed through me, because Holmes's tone had changed. Until now he had spoken of secrets, old injustices. Now he was speaking of something far darker. Mercer lowered his head, and for the first time since his arrest he looked afraid. There are moments in every investigation when the truth ceases to be an intellectual exercise and becomes something far more human. The revelations concerning Eleanor Pembroke had shocked us all. Yet as astonishing as they were, they belonged largely to the past. The greater question remained unanswered. What had become of Edward Pembroke? The missing man had vanished only weeks before. Someone in Blackthorn House knew the answer. And as Holmes had correctly observed, we had finally reached the point where mystery ended and crime began. The drawing-room remained silent. Mercer sat beneath the watchful gaze of Gregory's officers. His face seemed suddenly older. Holmes stood before him, dangerously patient. "Mr. Mercer." The solicitor raised his eyes. "You discovered that Edward knew the truth." Mercer nodded. "When?" "A month ago." Arthur stared. "My brother knew?" "Not at first." Mercer's voice was barely audible. "But he found documents. The hidden papers, the missing book, the burned fragment. Every clue returned to my mind at once." Holmes folded his arms. "He found Eleanor's records. He learned about the hidden lineage, and he intended to expose it." Mercer closed his eyes. Arthur sank back into his chair. The shock upon his face was painful to witness. My God! For several moments nobody spoke. Then Holmes asked the crucial question. "What happened next?" Mercer's shoulders sagged. "He confronted me." The room grew still. "He said the truth must be revealed. And you disagreed." "Completely." The solicitor laughed bitterly. "You must understand." "No," said Holmes, "I do not." Mercer looked away. "I believed I was protecting the family." Holmes's voice hardened. "At the expense of justice." No answer came. At last Gregory stepped forward. "Did you kill him?" The question struck the room like a gunshot. Mercer flinched. "No." "Then where is he?" "I don't know." The inspector frowned. "You expect us to believe that?" Holmes watched him carefully. I recognized the expression. He was testing the man's honesty, judging every hesitation, every movement, every glance. Finally Holmes nodded. To my surprise, "He speaks the truth." Gregory stared. "How can you know?" "Because he is guilty of many things." Holmes's eyes never left Mercer. "But not murder." The room fell silent. Arthur looked bewildered. If Mercer didn't kill Edward, then who did? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the window. Outside, the winter sky was darkening. The first shadows of evening stretched across the grounds. At length he spoke. "The answer lies in the whisper." "The whisper? The sound in the cellar?" "Precisely." Arthur frowned. "You know what caused it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I have known for some time." The statement produced a collective groan. Even Gregory threw up his hands. "Naturally." Holmes ignored him. "The whisper was never supernatural. No one believed it was," said Gregory. "On the contrary." Holmes glanced toward the servants gathered near the doorway. Several people did. A few embarrassed faces confirmed the observation. Holmes continued. "The sound originated within the hidden passages." "The tunnels?" I asked. He moved toward the fireplace. "The architecture beneath Blackthorn House creates unusual acoustic effects." Arthur blinked. "Meaning?" "A whisper spoken in one location may be heard clearly in another." Suddenly I understood. The voice, the cellar. The strange reports over the years, all perfectly natural. Someone was speaking through the tunnels. Exactly. Holmes nodded. And for decades people interpreted the phenomenon as something mysterious. Gregory looked thoughtful. Then Edward heard an actual voice. Yes. And followed. Then Edward heard an actual voice. Yes. And followed it. Exactly. Holmes smiled. The lantern. Everything returned to that lantern. The object Holmes had considered important from the beginning. Now I finally understood why. Edward had taken it because he expected to investigate, not because he intended to disappear. Arthur stared at Holmes. But who was speaking? A silence followed. Holmes turned slowly. His gaze settled upon Clara. The young woman froze. For a terrible moment I feared Holmes suspected her. Then he shook his head. No. Relief crossed her face. The detective continued. The speaker was someone hidden. Arthur frowned. Hidden where? The tunnels. The mysterious woman? Holmes nodded. The room became utterly silent. Every eye widened. The woman, the one Joseph had seen, the one connected to Eleanor's secret lineage, the one nobody truly understood. Arthur swallowed. Who is she? Holmes answered quietly. Eleanor's daughter. The effect was profound. No one moved. No one breathed. The hidden heir. Still alive. Still living beneath the estate. After all these years. Mercer covered his face. The years seemed to collapse upon him. She never left. Arthur stared. What? She refused. The solicitor's voice cracked. After her mother died, she remained. Good heavens! Holmes nodded sadly. The hidden room became her world. I felt a deep sense of horror. An entire life spent in secrecy. An existence concealed from society, from history, from justice. Arthur looked physically ill. My family did this? Not you. Holmes's voice softened. But others before you. At last Clara spoke. Then Edward found her. Holmes nodded. He heard her voice. The pieces clicked together. Edward followed the whisper. Entered the hidden chamber. Discovered the truth. Discovered the hidden woman. Discovered everything. Arthur rose abruptly. Then where is he? The question echoed through the room. Where indeed? If Edward was alive, why had he not returned? Why remain hidden? Holmes turned toward Mercer. The solicitor looked away. A tiny sign, yet Holmes caught it instantly. The detective's eyes narrowed. You do know! Mercer's composure shattered. For the first time genuine panic appeared. No. No. Holmes stepped closer. The room seemed to tighten around him. Edward is alive. Mercer said nothing. You know where. Still silence. Holmes's voice became very quiet. Tell us. The solicitor trembled visibly. At last he whispered. He found her. We know. They left together. The words struck the room like lightning. Arthur stared. What? Mercer nodded weakly. They left. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though confirming a final calculation. Then he smiled. A genuine smile. The case was solved. At last. Arthur looked utterly lost. They left? Yes, said Holmes. Why? Mercer laughed bitterly. Because Edward couldn't accept it. The solicitor's voice broke. He couldn't accept what had been done. The room fell silent. He said the family had stolen 2 lives, the hidden woman, and her mother before her. Mercer continued. He swore he would take her away. And he did? Asked Gregory. When? The night he disappeared. Everything suddenly made sense. No murder. No kidnapping. No supernatural mystery. Only a man who discovered an injustice and chose to correct it. Arthur lowered himself into a chair. The tension seemed to drain from him. My brother is alive. Holmes nodded. I believe so. And the woman? Also alive? Then where are they? Mercer reached into his coat. Slowly, carefully. A constable moved forward. Holmes raised a hand. It's all right. Mercer produced an envelope. I received this yesterday. He handed it to Holmes. The detective opened it, read silently, then handed it to Arthur. The older man stared at the contents. His eyes widened. It's from Edward. Yes. A smile touched Holmes's lips, the first genuine smile I had seen since arriving at Blackthorn House. The game, Watson, is finally over. Yet as I glanced at the letter, I realized one final chapter remained. Because Edward Pembroke had not merely vanished, he had left behind a message, and that message would determine whether the wounds of 40 years could finally heal. For several moments after Holmes handed over the envelope, no one spoke. Arthur Pembroke sat motionless in his chair, staring at the letter as though he scarcely trusted his own eyes. His hands trembled. Twice he attempted to unfold the paper and failed. At last Clara gently took the letter from him. "May I?" Arthur nodded. The young woman opened it carefully. The handwriting within was unmistakably Edward Pembroke's. A silence settled over the room as she began to read. "My dear Arthur, if this letter has reached you, then events have unfolded much as I expected. First, let me relieve your greatest fear. I am alive." Arthur closed his eyes. A long breath escaped him. It seemed the first easy breath he had taken in weeks. Clara continued. "When I discovered the truth beneath Blackthorn House, I believed at first that I had stumbled upon some family legend. The reality proved far worse. I found not a legend but a living victim. A woman hidden from the world because previous generations considered truth less valuable than reputation. I cannot adequately describe the shock of that discovery, nor can I describe the shame I felt upon learning that our family had participated in such cruelty." The room remained silent. Even Gregory appeared affected. The words possessed an honesty that could not be ignored. "When I confronted Mercer, he begged me to remain silent. He insisted the secret had become too old and too dangerous. He spoke of preserving the estate. I spoke of justice. We failed to persuade one another. After that conversation I made my decision." Clara paused. Her voice had become unsteady. Arthur gestured for her to continue. "The woman beneath the house deserved a life, not another decade of shadows, not another year of secrecy, not another day. Not another year of secrecy, not another day." So we left. A long silence followed. Then Clara resumed. "I do not know whether society will welcome her. I do not know whether the future will be kind, but I know with certainty that it will be better than the prison she has known. Please do not seek to force her return. She has already lost too much. If you wish to make amends, then let the truth finally be known. Your affectionate brother." When Clara finished reading, no one spoke. The crackling fire seemed unnaturally loud. Arthur stared into the flames. The letter remained in Clara's hands. At length Holmes broke the silence. "A remarkable man." Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes." His voice sounded thick with emotion. "Far better than the rest of us." "No." Holmes shook his head. "Merely the first to act." Mercer remained seated beneath the watchful eyes of the constables. He appeared utterly defeated. Years of secrecy had finally collapsed. At last Gregory turned toward him. "There will be charges." Mercer nodded. "I know." "You concealed evidence." "Yes." "You obstructed investigations." "You threatened witnesses." A pause. The solicitor's voice held no resistance, no excuses, only exhaustion. Holmes studied him thoughtfully. "Why continue so long?" Mercer laughed bitterly. "My father maintained the secret." He looked toward the portrait above the fireplace. "His father before him. Tradition?" The answer came immediately. "Fear of scandal, fear of losing the estate, fear of disgrace." Holmes nodded. "The oldest motive in England." Arthur rose suddenly. He crossed the room toward Mercer. For a moment I feared some angry confrontation. Instead, he stopped before the older man and spoke quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mercer's eyes lowered. "I convinced myself I was protecting you." Arthur laughed sadly. "Protecting me?" No answer came. Arthur shook his head. "You were protecting a lie." For the first time Mercer seemed genuinely ashamed. Later that evening Holmes and I walked once more through the grounds of Blackthorn House. The winter sky had cleared. Stars shone brightly overhead. The estate appeared strangely peaceful, as though the weight of its secrets had finally begun to lift. For some distance we walked in silence. Then I spoke. "So Edward wins." Holmes smiled faintly. "An unusual way of putting it, doesn't he? He found the truth, freed the woman, escaped Mercer. Also true." Holmes lit his pipe. The match glowed briefly in the darkness. "Then perhaps—" I considered the matter. "Will Arthur tell the world?" Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "I believe so." "You trust him?" The answer surprised me. Arthur had spent much of the investigation bewildered and frightened, yet Holmes seemed entirely certain. "Why?" "Because he has suffered." The answer struck me as distinctly Holmesian. "Suffering improves character?" "Sometimes." He glanced toward the house. "Not always." We reached the old stone wall bordering the estate. Beyond it stretched open countryside. For several moments Holmes remained silent. Then he said something unexpected. "Do you know what interested me most about this case?" I laughed. "The whisper?" "No." "The hidden room?" "No." "Mercer?" "No." Holmes smiled. "The lantern," I groaned. "Still the lantern. Always the lantern." He tapped ash from his pipe. "It was the first honest clue." "The first? Everything else was tangled in lies. I consider this. The lantern showed intent." "Exactly." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A man carries a lantern because he expects to investigate, not disappear." "Quite?" The simplicity of it struck me. A single ordinary object. Yet from that object Holmes had begun unraveling an entire history of deception. As we turned back toward the house, I glanced at him. "You knew surprisingly early." "No, not everything. Enough." "When?" Holmes smiled. "The portrait, of course, the portrait. The object that had first caught his attention." "Eleanor? What did you notice?" "The resemblance." "To Clara?" "Precisely." I stopped walking. The answer suddenly seemed obvious. The resemblance had been extraordinary, yet only Holmes had appreciated its significance. "You suspected the family records. I suspected the family tree, and from there, the rest followed gradually." Holmes resumed walking. As always, his explanation made the impossible seem inevitable. When we returned to the house, we found Arthur waiting for us. He carried a small box. "My brother left something else." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed?" Arthur opened the box. Inside lay several letters, and one photograph, a recent photograph, the woman who had lived beneath Blackthorn House. For a long moment we examined it. She appeared perhaps 40 years old, pale, reserved. Yet there was dignity in her expression, and unmistakably she resembled Clara. The similarity was undeniable. Arthur swallowed. "She deserves better." "Yes," said Holmes quietly, "she does." The older man looked at the photograph, then toward the hidden darkness of the estate. "I intend to find them." I frowned. "Edward asked you not to." Arthur nodded. "I know." His voice softened. "I don't intend to bring them back." He smiled sadly. "I intend to apologize." For perhaps the first time since arriving at Blackthorn House, Holmes appeared genuinely pleased. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I found myself reflecting upon the strange path the case had taken. We had arrived expecting murder. We had found secrecy. We had feared ghosts. We had uncovered injustice. And beneath it all lay a truth far older than any crime. The truth that deception, however carefully maintained, eventually collapses beneath its own weight. Even when buried behind stone walls, even when protected for decades, even when guarded by fear, truth waits, patiently, until someone finally listens to the whisper, and follows it into the darkness. Several weeks passed before Sherlock Holmes and I heard anything further concerning the affair of Blackthorn House. The investigation itself had concluded. Mercer had provided a full statement to the authorities. The hidden chambers beneath the estate had been documented. Family records were being corrected, and for the first time in nearly half a century the truth concerning Eleanor Pembroke had begun to emerge into the light. Yet one question remained unanswered. What became of Edward Pembroke and the woman he had rescued from the shadows? The answer arrived on a cold January morning. London was gripped by frost. The windows of Baker Street glittered with delicate patterns of ice. Outside, hansom cabs moved slowly through streets whitened by the night's snowfall. Holmes sat in his customary position beside the fire. A violin rested across his knees. He had spent much of the previous evening engaged in chemical experiments, and appeared unusually content. Such moods were rare. Holmes preferred intellectual stimulation to comfort, yet successful conclusions often produced in him a quiet satisfaction. I was reading the morning paper when Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a letter. "For you, Mr. Holmes." He accepted it casually. Then his expression changed. "News?" I asked. "Indeed." The letter bore a Surrey postmark. Holmes opened it. His eyes moved swiftly across the page. Then he handed it to me. "It appears our friends have written." The handwriting belonged to Arthur Pembroke. I began reading. "My dear Mr. Holmes, you requested that I inform you of any significant developments. I am happy to report that I have fulfilled my promise. Last week I located Edward." I immediately looked up. Holmes merely nodded. "Continue." I resumed. The meeting was emotional beyond description. My brother appeared considerably thinner than when I last saw him, though otherwise in excellent health. The lady accompanying him received me with understandable caution. I cannot blame her. After everything she endured, trust must come slowly. Yet she permitted me to explain myself. More importantly, she permitted me to apologize. I paused briefly. The next section seemed to affect even Holmes. Whether forgiveness will ever be possible I do not know, nor do I feel entitled to expect it. But at least the truth has been spoken aloud. For that I remain grateful. The letter continued. Edward intends to marry. A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. The ceremony will occur quietly in the spring. I have been invited. I intend to attend. Perhaps that alone represents progress? The final paragraph read, Blackthorn House feels strangely different now. The corridors seem brighter. The servants no longer fear the cellar. And most curious of all, the whisper has ceased. Yours sincerely, Arthur Pembroke. I folded the letter thoughtfully. The whisper stopped. Naturally, Holmes adjusted the violin upon his lap. Because the source vanished. The woman, precisely. He smiled faintly. The supernatural has a remarkable tendency to disappear when examined closely. I laughed. That observation should be engraved somewhere. It would save Scotland Yard considerable effort. For several moments we sat quietly beside the fire. The case appeared complete, resolved. Yet something continued to trouble me. At length I voiced the thought. Holmes. Yes? Do you ever wonder how many similar secrets exist? He considered the question. Frequently. Hidden histories, forgotten injustices, families built upon lies. Holmes nodded slowly. The world contains more concealed truths than visible ones. The answer was characteristic, neither cynical nor optimistic, simply factual. That evening I accompanied Holmes upon one of our customary walks through London. The city sparkled beneath fresh snow. Gas lamps glowed softly through the winter darkness. Pedestrians hurried along the pavements wrapped in heavy coats. For some time we walked without speaking. Then Holmes suddenly remarked, The most dangerous criminal in this case never stood trial. I glanced toward him. Mercer did. Mercer was merely a custodian. I understood immediately. The real criminals are long dead. Precisely. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. The men who imprisoned Eleanor, the people who stole decades from her daughter. He paused. Some crimes survive their perpetrators. The observation lingered in my mind. Even now, many years later, I believe it represents one of the wisest remarks Holmes ever made. Several months afterward, another letter arrived. This time it contained a photograph. The image showed 4 individuals standing together before a modest country house. Edward Pembroke, his bride, Arthur Pembroke, and Clara. All smiling, all free. The hidden woman who had spent most of her life concealed beneath Blackthorn House stood in sunlight. Real sunlight, perhaps for the first time in decades. Holmes examined the photograph carefully. Then he handed it back. A satisfactory outcome. Rare praise. It is deserved. I studied the image again. There was something deeply moving about it. Not because justice had been perfect. It had not. Lost years could never be restored. Pain could not be erased. Yet the future remained unwritten. Sometimes that is enough. Many of Holmes's cases ended with dramatic arrests. Others concluded with public acclaim. Some even altered the course of governments and nations. Yet this affair remained among the most memorable. Not because of its complexity, though it possessed plenty. Not because of danger, though danger certainly existed. But because of the whisper, a simple sound, barely audible. A sound dismissed for generations, ignored, mocked. Yet hidden within that whisper lay the truth. A truth capable of changing lives. A truth that waited patiently beneath stone walls until someone finally listened. I have often reflected upon that lesson. The smallest clue is not always the least important. A footprint, a scrap of paper, a forgotten photograph, or merely a voice in the darkness. Sherlock Holmes understood this better than any man I have ever known. Where others heard a ghost, he heard evidence. Where others saw superstition, he saw a pattern. And where others found mystery, he found truth. Thus ended the curious affair known between Holmes and myself as the Blackthorn House mystery. A case that began with a whisper from a basement, and changed everything.